Welcome to Cadalyst Magazine's CAD Manager Chronicles with CAD management expert Robert Green. This episode is sponsored by DraftSite from SolidWorks.
Hi, I'm Robert Green, and welcome to CAD Manager Chronicles. In episode 2 today, we'll be discussing your CAD management plan. Now, you have to have a plan. You simply must have a plan because failure to plan is planning to fail after all. So, what should we talk about when it comes to a CAD management plan? Well, a few things. Let's talk about software licensing, hardware, standards training, support, budgeting, cost reduction. How do we talk about all this? Well, it's a reasonable question. And what I've found works the best when I have groups of CAD managers that I talk to is to use a series of diagnostic questions. So I'll pose the questions to you. You answer honestly, and maybe you'd like to get a notepad or something going here where you can track your answers. And then I'll give you some conclusions along the way so that you can make up your mind about where your plan is, where you're deficient or where you're doing well, and that way you'll know what to improve upon. All right, let's get started. Here goes. First of all, software licensing. Here's your diagnostic questions. How many licenses of each type of software do you have at present? And how many will you really need next year? So here's my question. Are you really using all the software that you presently have? Or have you just been buying collections or software licensing packages that may be too much and you're not actually using all of it? Or maybe you have too many seats and you won't be using that many next year. Do you really need everything that you have? Because if you don't, you're spending too much money. Can you substitute less expensive software tools like generic products, let's say, instead of the very expensive name brand products that you may be using at present? Because if you could certainly save money. Could you share tools that you have more efficiently? For example, rendering tools, things that may not be in use all the time, but does need to support multiple users. Could you do a better job of that? Now, answer these questions honestly and ask yourself, what did you learn here? Because quite often I find that software licensing is simply a matter of habit. The company has been purchasing licenses for so long in the same manner that they're no longer asking themselves these critical questions. So take a moment, dig in and think about what your licensing posture really is and ask yourself, are we really getting the most bang for our buck when it comes to our licensing? Let's draw a conclusion. I think that understanding licensing requirements is one of the best ways that you can achieve savings in today's marketplace. And we all know that the cost of software is going up. So obviously, anything you can do to more optimally use software or minimize software usage, as the case may be, is going to help you find savings. And that's always a good thing. Now, let's move on to hardware. Here's your diagnostic questions. Do you really understand what configurations are required for the machines that you'll be supporting? Do you really know what a perfect configuration for BIM, General CAD, or a rendering workstation is? Because you may not. You may be in a situation where everybody gets the same type of machine and not everyone is optimally served. Will you be using more desktop or more mobile? Is the mix of that changing with work from home requirements? And this is something that you really have to think about because it not only affects how you specify machines, but it's going to specify your costs as well. Do you really know what your graphics processor or GPU requirements are for each type of software? This is impacted by people's use of rendering tools and other dependencies inside of the software packages they use. So you really need to make sure that you think about that and specify it correctly for each user configuration. Are you involved with setting these specifications? Okay. Are you working with IT or are you just a bystander in this process? And do you have a budget? So the follow-up question for that is, how involved are you really with specifying your hardware? Are you really taking the time to investigate and specify for all different usage cases around your environment so that your users get the right machine for the right task, rather than just being stuck with the machine that IT might want to give you. How involved in this process are you really? Well, if you don't specify the hardware you need, then somebody else is going to specify it for you. And they're going to give you what they think you need. And I've seen way too many CAD managers suffer with inadequately specified hardware. So don't let this happen to you. Get involved and make sure that you can give proper specifications for your workstation purchases. Standards and IT policy. This is a critical issue in your planning framework. So the questions might be, do you even have published standards? Are they up to date? Do users understand not only your CAD standards, but IT standards and policies for things like cloud tools or remote accounts? Do they understand what the specifications around personal devices, for example, using things on your personal iPad or phone? So are all of these types of standards specified? Do people understand them? Does management empower you to enforce these standards? That's a critical question, because what's the point of having standards if you can't enforce them? So the logical next question in that stream is, what can I do to drive standards adoption? Because simply yelling at people to follow the standard, in my experience, typically doesn't work. You have to have a way to persuasively bring people along and show them why standards make sense. And that's whether it's a CAD standard or an IT standard. It all comes out the same. So let's see how you could do that. Training. That's really the answer, because training allows you to make the standards something that users understand. So, do you have a training program? Do you have a training budget? You can say you have a training program, but if there's no training budget, then do you really have a training program? In my experience, no. Do you have independent training materials, be they written or video or something you could watch on an iPad or something on your corporate cloud? Is there something that people can refer back to so they can revisit training topics? Does your training reinforce your standards? Because it really should. If you give people a standard and then you train them how to use the standard, then they might actually use the standard. So this is why I say that driving standards adoption is really a function of training. So should you train on theory, or should you train on actual workflows? Well, my answer is always workflows and standards, because that's how you want people to work. So you should probably train them that way. Drawing conclusions. Standards allow you to create uniformity, which is what you want, because it drives efficiency, and training is what allows you to make those standards stick, what allows people to remember them. And the availability of a training program to re-emphasize, along with materials that people can independently review, is what really makes your standards program click. Next step in your plan, I want to talk about support. Now, here are your diagnostic questions. Do you have a support strategy, or do you just answer the phone and fight fires all day? Do you have adequate time to provide support in your schedule, or is support seen as just a necessary evil that we spend as little time on as possible? Is your support proactive or reactive? Again, are you fighting fires, or are you providing the type of support that really explains to people what they're doing wrong so that they won't do it wrong again? Do you find yourself in repeat mode? Are you constantly supporting people by repeating the same thing over and over? Because that's a clear giveaway that your training program isn't working. Or maybe you don't have a training program and you're just providing support on a fire brigade basis. Perhaps the most important question: what happens if support simply isn't provided? Well, people will go off and do whatever they want because they can't figure out the right way to do it. So that's what good support really does. Support is simply the reinforcement of standards in your training program, and it's the only way to stop bad CAD habits from forming. So in your CAD management plan, you've got to have a way to have a method for support. Now, budgeting. Obviously, everything we've talked about here is going to cost money, so you better have a budget for it, right? Well, it's surprising how many CAD managers don't. Or, if they do, they're not very involved in the process. So let's ask some diagnostic questions here. Do you really have a budget for hardware, software, training, support activities? Are you involved with that budget process? Because if you're not, you should be. Does IT listen to you when you create budgets for your hardware and training activities? Does your management listen to you in terms of trying to make your standards durable and make them stick with your user base? That has to go with your training program. Are you in charge of the budgeting process, or are you simply a passive victim along for the ride? Now, you know what I advocate here. You need to be part of the budgeting process, because if you don't ask, you won't get, and if you don't specify what you need, then how does your boss know what you need? Now, these are reasonable questions. If you don't create your own budget, somebody's going to create one for you, and they're going to impose it upon you, and that's going to be based on what they think you need, not what you actually need. So don't become a budgeting victim. Be part of the process. I want to wrap up talking about cost reductions and savings. Now, nobody ever got fired for saving money, right? Bosses love to save money. So CAD management needs to be something that stresses or that amplifies this idea of saving. So the diagnostic questions here are, where can you save money? And the answer to that I see most often is with correct software licensing. The right software, compatible software where you can, the right number of licenses, better sharing of applications. How can you drive real efficiency? Well, that's really standards and training. Find better ways to work, turn those better ways to work into standards, train people on those standards, and you will start to save time. We all know time is money, so efficiency is just as good as savings. Now, how can you motivate and retain talent? This is something that's a big question right now in the workplace, because it's very expensive to replace people and go through all that training curve and acquisition of software and get somebody into the office culture. Well, what you can do to motivate and retain your talent is to give them good hardware and support them well, because then they'll have the tools they need, the training they need, and the ongoing support to make sure that they can become better, more productive, and under less stress. So this all has to do with savings and should be part of your plan. Absolutely. Does management know that you're doing this? They need to. You have to make sure that you are advocating for savings and that your management team knows that you're doing so. If so, your stock will only go up, I promise. I've seen it way too many times. Let's draw a final conclusion. Save wherever you can. Always remember that saving time is the same as saving money, and walk around as a constant savings evangelist, making sure that your management hears you as you do so. If you do this, then you will find that your management will start to support you more. And if you notice, doing everything in the prior segments of our plan integrated very nicely with our ability to generate savings. Okay, let's wrap up. When we talk about our plan for CAD management, or actually any managerial undertaking, but CAD management in this case, you need to have a formalized plan of attack. You need to write it down, and you need to make sure that everybody knows what you're up to. So this means that your plan needs to be articulated to your users. It needs to be articulated to your management. It needs to be articulated to project managers or anyone who has real interaction with the CAD user community. And you need to advocate that plan by being an evangelist. So you constantly talking about how we can standardize this, how can we train this better, how can we provide better support, where do we have savings opportunities we're not taking advantage of, right? You have to do this. Your plan has to do this, because if you don't do it, who will? So if that's not the best statement for making your software plan, I don't know what is. So I hope that you'll be able to use some of these ideas to your advantage. Thanks for joining me today on the CAD Manager Chronicles. We'll be doing more of these, so I hope to see you back for a future episode. Take care.
Thanks for joining us today. Until next time, read more from Robert Green at Cadalyst.com. Thank you to our sponsor, DraftSight from SolidWorks.